giant orange records. Well, hey there. I just wanted to tell you about some psychedelic records that you've probably heard, and if you haven't, you probably should. This is like Psychedelic Rock 101, an intro to psychedelic music, part 1. And you may be asking, what the hell is psychedelic music? Well, a dear friend of mine and former bandmate once described it as mid-tempo songs with poetical lyrics. Maybe 60s psychedelic rock presented the first batch of songs and albums that were mid-tempo with poetic lyrics, but I can think of a lot of songs that are mid-tempo with poetic lyrics that are not necessarily psychedelic, but given the context of the mid to late 60s, you think most songs before that were maybe like a basic love story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Say like they describe the worst date you've ever been on or the best date you've ever been on, and they were all kind of tied to the culture of that time, from, you know, Buddy Holly to Chuck Berry to Little Richard up through like the soda pop stuff and maybe the surf music, even though surf music didn't have a lot of lyrics. And then like sort of the early British invasion, which was again like Chuck Berry but played faster with better amps and better recording equipment by people from a different country. To me, I think psychedelic music is more experimental. It's a little weird, it's a little different. It's not exactly mainstream. It's very counterculture. It's probably influenced by, you know, people started using drugs in the 60s, you know, hopefully the innocuous type that doesn't harm anybody too badly. Or maybe people's minds were expanding. People were sort of in this spirituality thing. There was a lot of counterculture. It was like a us versus them, the young people versus the old people, the new order versus the old order, all that kind of stuff. Very like heady stuff. People were getting very like philosophical, and again with the moralism was probably on the rise. There was, you know, civil rights, maybe the beginning of women's rights, and a lot of anti-war, anti-Vietnam War protests going on, because people started to realize that maybe war is kind of pointless and kind of stupid, especially when it's so far removed from your own backyard that you don't know much about it. So, starting with the Beatles Revolver. Hopefully you've heard this album, or some songs off of this album. You've probably heard Eleanor Rigby, but maybe you haven't heard Tomorrow Never Knows. But this is such a head trip, heady album that, you know, it was the Beatles like intentionally starting to become very psychedelic. There's Indian instruments. George Harrison was really getting into that stuff at the time, and sort of the Buddhism and spirituality trip. And I mean, just look at the album art. The album art is very psychedelic. Like the Beatles' heads are blending into each other. And yeah, this is a very, very good place to start. Even the guitar solo on Taxman is very psychedelic in that it's different. Psychedelic music was kind of starting to get away from the blues rock, and it was heavy, but it wasn't heavy in the way that, like, say, 1969 was. And most of these albums I'm talking about today are from 1966 or 1967. The psychedelic sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators. Now, this was a band from Austin, Texas, who had very, you know, spiritual and perhaps drug-fueled lyrics. They were the first band to use the word psychedelic in their album title, and the appearance of the psychedelic sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators might be the first time the word psychedelic was breathed into existence in print. This is a 1978 Radar/WEA pressing. This one is actually, this record itself was made in Greece. Apparently the master tapes for this record had been altered or lost or changed beyond recognition over time. This is why like first presses of this album sell for $800 to $1,000 on the internet and other places. But this is a pretty affordable copy, especially compared to that. And it was made from those original master tapes before they were altered. It's the best sounding copy of this record that I have to date. Pink Floyd, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. I mean, this might arguably be the #1 and best psychedelic album of all time. Even if you haven't heard this record, you've probably heard of the band Pink Floyd by now. They're kind of big. What's different about this album is the band was being led by Syd Barrett at the time, who was one of the original founders and like sort of mad geniuses of the psychedelic movement. And these guys, you know, they had some lyrics about gnomes, Lewis Carroll. There's a lot of Alice in Wonderland references. It's very, psychedelic rock is very surreal. It's very dreamlike, and maybe that's sort of influenced by the culture of the time. But, you know, it's like Alice in Wonderland in that sense. Very dreamy, very surreal. Things that don't necessarily go together are put together. The music on this is it's fantastic. It's almost like it's almost very punk rock in a lot of ways. When I was about 15 or so, I found the CD of this at Best Buy, and I bought it because I'm like, whoa, that's a really cool cover. I'd never heard it before. And I was like, well, I know Pink Floyd from Dark Side of the Moon and some of the songs they'd been playing on classic rock radio at the time. But then I got this CD and I was just blown away. I couldn't even believe it was a Pink Floyd record because it sounded so different from everything else. It's just like way more balls to the wall, trebly guitar, experimental. It's kind of crazy. It makes you feel like you're on something even when you're not. And I think that was kind of what drew me in at the time. Another cool anecdote about this band is my dad, he grew up in Switzerland in the 60s. He was really into music. So he said he saw Pink Floyd in 1968 and they played in his small town of Abbtwil, Switzerland, which is a suburb of St. Gallen, which is not the biggest city either, but it's a, very nice old European city, as they tend to be. But he said they played there at a local gymnasium. And he said there were about 200 people there when the show started. And my dad was about one of 10 people who stayed there. And he said that the avant-garde music was just like too out there for most people at the time. It threw him off. And I'm thinking, 1968 would have been about when David Gilmour had taken over after Syd Barrett kind of became not the best band member to the rest of his bandmates. And, well, there's a lot of information about what happened, but basically he probably had some mental problems, and doing LSD every day didn't help because his friends and hangers-on were dosing him in his tea all the time or something like that. Anyway, that's how, I think the Nick Kent account of it is. Anyway, my dad saw them. He was one of the few people at the time that spoke English, and he went and talked to him, and he's like, oh man, I'm so sorry that everybody left, and it's such a shame that nobody understands your music. But, he got it and he stayed, and he said even in 1968, Pink Floyd was unloading their own equipment, and even then they had kind of a lot of equipment for rock band standards. Anyway, this is a brilliant album that everybody should listen to. Lately I've been kind of on this kick of getting back to the basics. It's, with psychedelic rock, you can really go down this really obscure rabbit hole and get to the point where it's like, is this even good, or am I trying to find this record just because it's so rare that I haven't heard it and maybe parts of it are good? But the albums I'm showcasing here are top tier. They're well produced by pretty much the best of the best making the music, writing the music at the time, exploring new things, and a lot of these cats did it first, and they did it better than everybody else. Right, Bear? Right, Bear? The Jimi Hendrix experience. Are you experienced? Well, are you experienced? I love the photograph on the front cover. Is probably done with an infrared camera, which is sensitive to temperature more than it is to light. Very kind of surreal effect here. I mean, Jimi Hendrix, one of the greatest, most innovative guitar players of all time. I don't think many guitarists have caught up to what he was doing when he was alive, but that's neither here nor there. This is just a killer album. Surely you've heard some of these songs before, like Purple Haze and Hey Joe. I mean, I think pretty much every band in the 60s covered Hey Joe, but after Hendrix did it, I don't think a lot of other people dared to do it because his version was the version of the song. The Wind Cries Mary, Fire. I mean, personally, this is my favorite Hendrix album. I've listened to it way, way more than any of the other albums, and I hear new things every time I listen to it. I would recommend getting a stereo copy just because there's a lot of like panning, stereo panning, back and forth kind of stuff. And that is part of the experience. This is the Zombies, Odyssey and Oracle. This album was recorded in 1967 at Abbey Road Studios in London, England, shortly after the Beatles cut Sgt. Pepper there. Odyssey and Oracle was one of the first really psychedelic albums I ever got to listen to. I think I was a senior in high school when I heard it, and had just gone through some things, and this album just like fit those feelings perfectly. It was wintertime when I heard this, and in South Carolina there is, believe it or not, a mild winter, so like there's no leaves on the trees and stuff like that. This album really, really hit the spot at that time. I thought it was weird. I fell asleep to Hung Up on a Dream one time. I'd gotten the CD of this, and this is an alternate cover from 1969, I believe. And it's just a detail of the album. I don't have the album with the proper cover, and to get an early release of that is mucho dinero, which I don't like to spend too much money on albums. I just want a playable, enjoyable copy. And this one set me back $4. Now the Zombies were definitely part of that sort of poetic, whispery kind of psychedelic experience. It wasn't too moody or anything. They were not jammy at all. The songs are very short and concise. My two favorite songs here are Beechwood Park and Brief Candles. And speaking of poetic, they even quote Shakespeare on the back of this album. So now we're moving on to the LA bands that were psychedelic. The Byrds, Younger Than Yesterday. Hopefully you've heard a couple songs off of this record. We all know that Tom Petty covered So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star on his Full Moon Fever album. But the Byrds version just had this special magic to it. This was where the Byrds bassist Chris Hillman started to become a major songwriter. He wrote Have You Seen Her Face and some other songs on here. David Crosby wrote some really cool stuff like Renaissance Fair. Very kind of hippie flavor-ish, but the Byrds kind of had that like, they were the folk rock band. They had the jangle, the 12-string thing, sort of like the protesty side of folk rock, but in a more rock and roll context, which was a bit more presentable, a bit more palatable. It didn't quite hit you over the head as much. And you can see the artwork here is getting a bit more psychedelic. This is a double exposure, it looks like, on a camera, which was thing you could do on a lot of film cameras by taking a picture and then rolling the film back and taking another picture on top of the previous picture. Time Between, Everyone's Been Burned, and Thoughts and Words are great songs on this record. And they're still covering some Bob Dylan with My Back Pages. And to keep it going with LA bands, Love Forever Changes. This was a integrated band led by Arthur Lee, who was their main songwriter. You could say this guy was very, very poetic. This band actually influenced the Doors. They were on the same label, Elektra, which tended to be kind of like a more artsy kind of label. If you look at the drawing on the cover, it looks sort of like the continent of Africa. Maybe you've heard the song Alone Again or in the Wes Anderson movie Bottle Rocket. Maybe you haven't, but this album is just... The first time I heard it, I didn't really get it, I gotta admit, but I was pretty young. And then, in the meantime, I'd listened to an English group called The Clientele from the early 2000s, and I really liked their music, and they mentioned Arthur Lee and Love in an interview as being an influence, so I went and checked this out again, because like a friend had played it for me previously, and I'm just like, what is this? But I eventually came around to it, it just clicked. Like, that's the thing about like psychedelic rock or punk rock, it's just like, once it clicks, and there's no other way to explain it. Either you get it or you don't. It's very introspective in a lot of ways. There's songs that are very like apocalyptic, kind of end of the world times. We're gonna have a nuke dropped on us, so we might as well have fun before that happens. But, you know, it's also kind of like the dark side of that too. It's like, well, we're all doomed anyway. My favorite tracks on here are Alone Again or Live and Let Live. A House Is Not a Hotel, which has this really cool dual guitar solo thing. Again, in stereo, like one guitar is in one channel, the other guitar is in the other channel. I've always kind of wanted to do that in a rock band because I thought that'd be so cool. And More Again, The Daily Planet, The Red Telephone. A lot of good stuff here. And how could we forget the Doors' fantastic debut album? Again, the Doors were influenced by the Seeds, the Velvet Underground, and Love. Arthur Lee and Love. Right, Arthur Lee? Right, Arthur Lee? But they very much did their own thing. The Doors did the two things that bands have to do to stand out. They were different and they were good. And they kind of did the thing that they did first, and they did it very well. Break On Through is a great track. The musicians on this, I almost feel like the musicians are kind of shine through with the Doors. That's the reason they were so good. I mean, Jim Morrison obviously was a charismatic frontman, but sometimes the whole like Lizard King thing and, oh, look at me, I'm a poet and I know it kind of thing rubs me the wrong way, in the way that like Bob Dylan really is a poet, or Arthur Lee really is a poet, and their lyrics and words speak for themselves, so they don't have to actually say it and articulate it. But anyway, I love this record. Every time I hear it, I just find it to be completely irresistible music. They kind of get into some of the longer jams. If you listen to the intro of Light My Fire, it's very classical, and maybe there's a side of psychedelic rock that is very Baroque, as they call it, which had a lot of harpsichords and keyboards and was influenced by Baroque and classical type music. And here's another LA band, the West Coast Pop Art Experimental Band, with an absolutely cosmically ridiculous title that might be the most literal band name of all time, or at least of the first era of the psychedelic times. This was the first kind of expensive record I bought. At the time, I think it cost, I guess the sticker fell off, but I think I paid like 20 or 25 bucks for this, which was a lot for records at that time. This is an original US stereo pressing from 1967. It's got quite a few scratches in it. But anyway, I absolutely freaking love this album. To me, it is one of the most important psychedelic albums. It's kind of influenced by Love and the Byrds, and maybe Frank Zappa, and the Velvet Underground, but it's different from all of those. It is very West Coast. It is very experimental, and it is very pop art. But at any rate, there is a very kind of weird backstory to this band. You can look it up sometime at your own leisure. But what really matters is the music that came out was just like really brilliant. They took the Byrds and Love and put their own sort of edginess to it. And again, the artwork is getting very, very out there and very psychedelic, very kind of trippy sort of, colors on a projector type of thing. And this is going to be the only compilation that I'm going to include here. This is the Nuggets compilation, which came out in 1972 or 1973 perhaps. And at that time, the culture had totally moved on from everyone's souls being psychedelicized in 66 and 67 and beyond. So this is sort of like an oldies artifact compilation. These are more almost garage bands, but I'd say a lot of these bands were kind of professional bands at the time. They probably made a living from their music. And a lot of these had even been sort of radio hits at the time. It's almost like the Bible of psychedelic rock, garage rock, and punk rock before punk rock. This is a double LP. And again, these are shorter songs, but it's like the flow of these is so good. There's a thematic unity to this compilation, which makes it so great. And one thing about a lot of these LPs I'm talking about today is they've stood the test of time. A lot of this music was recorded 50, almost 60 years ago at this point. And it's still held up. It's still interesting. It was so different and innovative that people might not have latched onto it at the time because the time passed so fast. And again, like Nuggets is a very good indication of how quickly things were changing at that time. So that was 10 psychedelic rock albums that are sort of like an intro to psych music. The heavy hitters, like the basic ones that even if you've become kind of jaded about psych rock and gone down the rabbit hole of completely obscure bands, it's really good to revisit these albums every once in a while and just to remember probably why you got into this stuff in the first place. And one honorable mention here is Creedence Clearwater Revival's first album, self-titled, from 1968. There is quite a bit of jamming on this album. Quite a bit of like fuzzy, crazy guitar solos. Sorry, but this is the only San Francisco band I'm going to feature right now. But there will be more. Again, this is like an intro, sort of like your 101 crash course, absolute basics in psychedelic rock, but I don't really think there's anything basic about any of these because these were the heavy hitters of the time, and they're still heavy hitters now because they've stood up to the test of time.